la famille.
Welcome everyone. We're going to try to make that session as interactive as possible, as we discussed with Alex during the preparation. So feel free to either speak or even if you want to put the questions in the chat. So my name is Jacques. I'm the CRO for Cooptalis. Our dream at Cooptalis is to spot, move, and grow talents. So basically the idea is that through spot we recruit, through move we help them move, so the immigration and the relocation, and through grow we train. And so of course when I'm going to try to see if I can share that screen now. Of course when we discuss the topic of tonight with Alex, let me see, Alex confirm that the screen appears properly here.
Yes, it's perfect.
Thanks. So, of course, when we discussed the topic and we landed on how to create an inclusive culture for international and remote employees, I thought, big topic for us as we spot, move, and grow talent. International is at the heart of everything we do, and remote is such a big topic. It was before the pandemic, but of course, our context makes it even more present. So what we thought also is, since we are with the family, and I thought I'd use a little story that I don't know if some of you in the room have seen that movie. If you, I'll try not to do spoilers, but I'll take you through a journey with the characters of that movie. So if that's okay with you, we get started. So what characterized the international and remote employees? In the movie, you could argue, is this one of my international or remote employee? Hopefully it's not. And where is my remote employee at the moment? And the reason why I put those two things is that I want to make you guys reflect on the fact that working in different locations is fairly new. Actually, it's not something that we got used to in the last few hundred years. And so when we look at organizations today, it's deeply impacted by some factors in terms of leadership, distributed leadership, the way to organize teams, and so on. And a number of things that we have in mind when we look at growing and steering a boat in the same direction is, and I can see big mission to help talent move. Yes, especially now. Like we can talk about that later. But in order to steer an entire team in the same direction, there is a lot of conceptions around the fact that the army has one general, the captain has the boat has one captain, etc. And in the ecosystem of the family, I know there's a lot of startups, and it's one of those first things that actually looked at. If you look at investors, for example, that looked at several leaders being better than one. That's a concept that is very, let's say, very newish if we look at the last 200 years of leadership and in team management and things like that. The idea here is that there's some interesting studies around companies with several co-founders tend to perform slightly better than with a single co-founder or a single general manager. And of course, it's linked to the idea of scaling and of getting international. So let me comment a couple of things here. If you look at the political campaign of Macron, putting politics aside, he looked at a very strong team of like 400,000 members, and he appeared very strong on being able to create that collective, and we'll see how it's linked to international soon, or remote very soon. And then when he won, he actually appeared on his own, like the old, let's say, vision of leadership. If you look at even further before the Olympics, for instance, the Olympics was a men-only thing, and to win, you just need to be the first. It was not like, it wasn't a team thing. And same for gods, and same for the lion in the jungle, and so on. Why do I mention that? It's because when we look at distributed teams, international team, remote teams, the logic of hierarchy and of leadership is quite different from when you have, let's put that slide back, when you have this type of style. And the idea behind that is that the culture of the company is going to play a super key role in making a difference between engaged, motivated, aligned, remote or international teams versus when you're all in the same place and you can assess like the teamwork or this type of teamwork in a local context, let's say. So when we look at these things, we look at different. We try to rethink what we measure, and what we observe there. And I'm going back to the brothers and sisters in the gold rush, is that we went from a lot of companies extracting resources or producing stuff to a challenge of using a connected brains, right? And the connection of connected brains is fairly recent. In fact, I often mention that we looked at old industry vocabulary for the tech world, right? We speak about website architecture, we talk about data mining, we talked about extraction. So we looked at the old industries somehow, and we adapted some of the vocabulary. And when we think about, we did a little game of saying, okay, what should be the P&L of a startup, the profit and loss of a startup? Could it be that it's like people in learning, and that we connect those guys, and the people in learning makes those distributed teams work better? And hopefully with that, we trigger a little bit of thinking already with how do I get to a system which is very hierarchical and very say output driven, like how much gold do I extract, or how many cars do I produce? It gets a bit more difficult when we produce, say, digital stuff, or where we collaborate digitally, which is obviously very, very often the case when we look at international or remote employees. So I'll probably pause there and see if with that concept it's clear, or if there are any questions. Otherwise, I go to the next point of the discussion. Is that
just
clear?
a quick question, Jacques? Maybe you mentioned about, it's easier to have co-founders, to not be alone, and that's better for success, for energy. But at the same time, the biggest cause of death is like internal fights between the core co-founders or the first employee. But what will you advise to our entrepreneurs listening to make sure that they prevent that?
Yeah, that's a very good one. And in fact, you can look at entrepreneurs, but then you can also think about your country manager in a new country, because he's connected to the group, but he's also on his own in the country, right? So this part is going to be super important to start with oneself, and then look at the collaboration. And then we'll make a little difference between collaboration and cooperation. I don't know if you guys in the audience know the difference between the two, but for us at Cooptalis, when we look at the culture, we make a difference between collaborating, is like work together, and cooperating, which is work together with the same goal, which is quite different. But to answer your point, the first thing is, how do we, as an entrepreneur or as a founder, sustain performance over the time, knowing that there's only 168 hours during a week, right? So it's like, you obviously need to focus very strong on you, master the way you distribute your time. And then what we look at is, how much time do you invest in that relationship with your co-founders, right? And so happens, like the same happens with probably your country managers if you decide to go international. And somehow the same happen with your remote employees, right? Because at the end, it's like the relationship you build with your co-founder that gets you in business together. Once you start operating, and once you, let me put that one back, once you get into the ride and as the first turbulences are coming, it's very easy to forget that the key part is the close relationship that you have with the co-founder. It's like, how much time do you invest in order to make sure that relationship remains healthy, remains good, etc., etc. And what we observe is that a lot of time, the conflict that you refer to, Alex, they come because that time is shortcut, and that it's very hard to press pause once you're 6,000 feet above the sky. It's not like you can press pause and say, okay, let's go on a holiday for a week and catch up with the co-founder. It rarely happens. So here, the sustained performance over time is very much under time pressure, so to speak. Because there's only X hours in the week, and both co-founders probably have a family life, etc. So it's going to be like, how do you strategize not only the P&L elements, but also that relationship element that is super critical and very often overlooked. And in what some of the scale-ups that we helped over the years, they organize some ping pong, which is really like when I have the ping pong ball in the hand, I'm the one speaking, and then I pass on that ping pong ball to my other co-founder, and when I hold the ball, then I'm the one to speak. And it's a simple thing, but it's a very important conversation, and very often the conflict that you mentioned is because of the lack of time taken to really have those proper chats and those proper professional feedback sessions. So that's a shortcut, let's say, that we do. And in remote and international teams, it's equally important. What we see is that usually we look at very logistical details and so on, and we say, oh, yeah, we'll catch up once a week and so on, but the catch up is not necessarily so true to build the relationship as much as, maybe the goals are clear, the financial goals is very, if we look at remote or international, it's probably usually a bit different. The international guy has a number of tasks to fulfill, and when we catch up, we look at that. But what we look at is, it's even more important in that context to put a relationship index, a stamina index, a time management index, because when you're on your own, like, it's not like if I go back there, it's not like you've got that same peer pressure level to organize that so much. So it's something that is important. And then as we go further through those circles, it's like the work on the relationship, the work on time, and then of course the market comes in and the customer comes in. But usually by doing a shortcut and addressing directly customer and market needs and not working so much on this, eventually those guys are impacted. If you follow me there, eventually the customer is impacted because we are less able to listen to market elements, etc. Because we are stuck in that conflict that you mentioned, Alex. It's like we are stuck into people management issues and so on. And so I guess the key element there is not only the relationship itself, it's what do we do to sustain our own performance. That's one. How do we strategize the use of time? That's another. That's two. How much time do we decide to allocate to the relationship with the co-founder? Is that 2 lunches a week, whatever, like the right level is for each of us around the table here. But it's basically that idea. And then of course, as the complexification comes and you have more remote people and things accelerate, if you're in a scale-up environment, or say some of you might prepare a fundraise and you're head-on focused on the fundraise or Series A, Series B, whatever. But then what happens is you omit to strategize this part. And you might say, as soon as I raise funds, I'm going to get big sister, little sister, the chemist, the wild card, etc. And I'm going to work on the logistics of getting those guys in. But I usually anticipate a little bit less how am I going to craft the relationship within those guys, between those guys that may not know each other that well yet. And so this part is we see in companies usually, Alex, to take your point, is usually that conflict comes because of a time issue. It's like because we didn't have time to get to know each other properly, or because we did that, but then it accelerated, and then those regular conversations couldn't happen just because, for example, say it may sound familiar, but the expansion manager suddenly went from 1 to 6 direct reports. HR came in, but it took some time to readjust, and in the meantime, we didn't have those conversations and so on. So what we look at here is how do we plan that ahead, and how in that right team and diversity check, depending on the speed, we look at HR, coaching, mentoring, and so on support. Example for how do you sustain remote international employees when you are scale up and you're in the middle of the pandemic, for example. We've got, of course, coach can help, but we also have like non-exec advisory boards, for example, that you have locally that can really look at the local situation of your international employee, because that's a part of the value that that person expects that probably you in headquarters, for example, cannot give. And so there are tips like this around how do you use the time, the relationship, and the speed, and so on, to make sure that that relationship element and those discussions element are sustained over time and over scale-ups or just growth if it's not super fast. And then obviously what is very different, and a lot of our, say, reflexes or the how do you say, the typical reaction to certain things is to get more hierarchy. And that's because, again, a CEO comes from chief executive officer that comes from the army, right? So like the way we structured organization, it hasn't evolved so much from, say, army or maybe manufacturing also, where you had to split production in a very systematic way, etc., etc. And of course, startups arrived with squads and so on. But still, because it's so anchored in our ways to perceive leadership, it's not so easy to have real distributed leadership within the teams. And in remote and international, because the motivation and the check is not possible, because you can't check if the person is here and does and so on, it's even more critical to think about these things. It's like, how do you make sure that those, what I call the good old pyramids, are really replaced with diverse clusters? And here is one of the ways to look at clusters, and or squads, or whatever, whichever fancy buzzwords we use to call the group of people working together. But essentially here, what we look at, it's not like necessarily, you know, back-end developer and UX and PO, etc. It's just, it's different personalities. And we know that when it goes faster and faster and faster, having those different personalities within the team, that will make that team resilient. And if you have a lot of remote, it's going to be super critical to have those different personalities, because otherwise it might go a little bit south faster. Or Alex, the conflicts that you mentioned, they might actually raise faster. There's a lot of science around that. We've got, I think we said 15, 20 minutes, so I'll go fast. But if you guys are interested in this, we can talk further. On the goals, on the goal management, a lot of you guys would know OKRs, probably the objectives and the key results. Essentially, that's a way to achieve those distributed leadership and so on, because you say, okay, Jacques, you're going to be in charge of that type of sales, that type of team management, and you need to develop, I don't know, six new locations, for example. And that's a way to collaborate with distance in a very effective way, because typically the co-founders own the OKRs of the company. That's the logic. And then everybody in the management team will own part of those big goals. And then everybody within the teams of the managers own some of the goals. And so this is a very effective way to manage remotely, because it gives that ownership. So I guess the key word in this slide is really ownership. Is I give you the keys for those OKRs, typically managed quarterly, and typically managed with very, very easy things to debate. Typically, it's a gross margin number, it's a number of locations opened, it's a number of people hired. It's something that there's not much debate. It's a product that is launched at a certain date, so it's not something that can really be debated. So how do we get to those things? It really needs to be debated under what we call our ping pong, like what I mentioned before. It's it has to be crystal clear, and the ping pong needs to occur until it's crystal clear for everybody. So that goes to extreme alignment and this type of notions that are very important for remote employees and international employees. So the logic around that is a new employee, whether it's international or remote, comes on board, and suddenly he has those 168 hours, and usually he's working, depending on where he is in the world or where she is in the world, she has between, say, 35 and maybe 40 plus. Yeah, David, no problem to make the slides public later on. Is like once you have those, you have time capital here. So say the employee leader comes in, and suddenly you have, let's for the sake of the example, 40 hours, and you have 40 hours worth of production. And usually, this is what happens, right? It's like you're gonna fill it in, sometimes in the right order and sometimes in the wrong order. I don't know if you all know that metaphor. So here is going to be an employee that quickly is going to go to burnout, and that's because the onboarding hasn't been super well planned. And say, for example, you have someone running your payroll in a certain place, and you say we're going to get remote and international employees, and suddenly that person still has the same stuff that he or she had to do, but she also had the extra complexity of managing the remote or the international employee. And it's not super complex or it's not impossible, but it just has to be planned properly. Otherwise, you get into that situation. And I guess you know the difference between this situation and this situation. As like this one is like sustained over time, and this one is going to decrease performance massively after a while because it's too stretched. The good thing is, and I'm always using that little one. Maybe some of you know it. Is that in both cases you can still pour a cup of coffee and it will fit. So that's an important element to monitor. And it's harder to see. Remember what I showed before with this guy. Is like it's harder to see the guy in remote or international environment in that situation because he might not show on screen that he's here. He might say, "Oh, everything's fine. It's here." And to get to know if your remote employees are here, you really need to develop trust. And so back to what I was saying before, in order to do that, you need to do it for yourself, and you need to lead that by example, and you need to develop enough relationship to detect whether the employee is here or here. And the way to do that is very simple. It's like the cup of coffee that fits in both jars and the ping pong. And the ping pong is something I think is very important for teamwork. It's I don't know if some of you already heard about this, but it's like right time, right place, equal time of speech, and the type of feedback culture and so on. But it's quite important. And obviously to get successful projects, the more you work internationally and remotely, the more complexity you get. So what we look at is changing a little bit the typical measures, right? That we look at, especially for remote and international. It's probably even more important. Is that you look at your sales, you look at the time to market, you look at whatever. But this part, energy burning, stress, instability, misalignment, and so on, these are super key criteria in general, but even more when you're international or remote. So speaking about cohesion and so on, I guess the key message here is that depending on the time and speed, you're going to have different challenges, and it's just a matter of spending a little of time to think about it. This one is very good. Some of you may have read it. I always like to share a couple of reading tips during presentation. This one is a recent reread because it's very solid. And what it mentions is that by creating principles around your teamwork strategies, your remote work strategies, and your international work strategy, you just force yourself to anticipate those things that are usually put second priority, but in the end, it's such a priority that it's probably worth it. And they just launched an app as well. He launched an app that is pretty nice to set your own principles. So I recommend it. And this one is one of the key thing around creating the right culture for inclusive culture and so on in international remote environment. And here, that's where I mentioned a couple of things around the evolution of the HR key vocabulary. And I find it funny because it's usually US driven. It's usually them, influencing the world on these things. And it started with administration. That goes back to the factory. Business partner is like we need to do something because it looks like the human capital is important. It's no longer a resource from mining, extraction, or automotive. It's now a human capital. Then this part is really nice. It's like people and culture. We figure out that it might be connected. We don't know exactly how, but so it's like people on one side, culture on the other side. Then chief happiness, and we already questioned this, and we realized that it's not enough. But basically, around these things, the key point is that building the pillars to get those remote and international employees to really be engaged, we need to look at the self-management, what we call the extreme stakeholder environment, and an element like trust. And these are not necessarily measures in scale-up phases. And we see deeply the impact of the scale-ups there. So obviously, same stuff about the feedback. And what we very strongly look at is that when it goes fast, Alex, again, thanks for the question before, because it's like when you see those conflicts and when you see those moments where employees, even far away, could start to create, there's a bit of tension and so on. That's where you really need to assess that metric, see the engagement, and get there. And I guess to conclude, it's like we discussed it with Alex. I come from a sports background, so I have like the reference of a sports team making big achievements. And when you look at the business culture and the remote and international culture, where you can't debrief, you can't re-watch the game and so on, it's like, how do you get from that to that? How do you get to the soup syndromes where everybody is trying to collaborate but not cooperate properly to win, especially with distance and time pressure? It's more and more complex. How do you make sure that you do the Champions League type of organization? So I'll leave you with that. But the quote that I'd conclude with is one of the favorite handball coach that says, "Speaking makes people laugh. The party, if you do it, that's where people shut up and are impressed." So I hope that everybody in the room can actually achieve that, because that's the nice part of it.
Thank you, Jacques. Well done. Very quick, full of content presentation, and we'll have to go back to the main room in 4 minutes. But we have a question from David. He's asking, David Pires, how can you find about the different personality when people work remotely? Do you use tests for it, or do you find it naturally? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's a good one. So it's both. Okay, so the test actually, I always say when we use tests, that the test is a trigger for the conversation. So the test, if I go back to my handball parallel, the sports parallel, is like you will burn less energy being a goalkeeper than being a central guy on the field, right? So the test will help you start a conversation on a different level than your typical targets. It will start saying, hey, you know that you behave like this under stress, or hey, you know that you've been procrastinating a lot lately because maybe your personality is more like this, is more about a social one, and with the pandemic, it's hard for you. And this type of a conversation, it creates rapport, and it creates a very important element for teams, which is, you might have heard of that, it's psychological safety. So that element of psychological safety in teams is a super key driver, especially now for to be able to speak out and trust your teams. And this you create, of course, analyzing the test, it's useful. But for example, I always say that a test is not a decision-making tool for recruitment. It's like, it may be 5, 10, 15% of your decision, but the key part of those 15% is the discussion subsequent to the test. It means the employee remotely doing the test online and reading the results, analyzing its own results, like the notion of ownership. What do you get out of what you read? And then talking through the plus and minus to basically create that rapport, but not just the rapport of friendship or anything, just a professional rapport saying, hey, you're burning less energy with this type of task because your strength is there. How, as the manager, do I make sure that you're using the energy in the right way? Because we're all the same. Like I think the principles book is very strong on this, is we all wired differently. And if we work on things we really like, on strengths and so on, it's proven, same for sports, that we're gonna burn less energy. So by using that energy level properly, that's how you find out more, and it's not written in stone at a given time. It's also something that that evolve through the professional development of the team or of the squad. Does that answer your question, David?
Amazing, Jacques. I really like how you managed to bring this sports, energy, stamina into a very technical, complex, HR subject that entrepreneurs have to know about in order to make their business sustainable. So really well done for that. So Alice is going to start in a few seconds on the main stage. So if there is no final question, or maybe you want to say your last word to the audience. I mean, some of them have specific requests. You will receive that after to be able to answer. But if there is no final question here, maybe a final word of wisdom, Jacques?
I would say make sure you join on the main stage at 8 p.m. And Alex, thanks a lot for having me there. And everybody, I hope you enjoyed that. And I stay available if you have further questions. But we said 30 minutes. We're at 29, so I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Jacques, and thank you, Cooptalis, for making this happen. And all the workshops are now closed. So see you on the main stage. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining. Que la famille.